Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm very glad to welcome you here this afternoon to this discussion with former Attorney General Bill Barr about his great book, One Damn Thing After Another, Memoirs of an Attorney General. I'm not going to get into any introduction much for someone who you all know very well, but I will say that he has been Attorney General for two presidents, an Attorney General in 2 centuries. You were the 77th and the 85th. And he's done us the great service of writing a book about his experiences in those 2 administrations and his life. And, I, as a writer, a thinker and reader of books about politicians and politics, I read a lot of these books. And this is really an unusual one. It's very, very good. It's a great description of the challenges that he faced and of his life. And I want to thank you for them. One of the other things about it, if you read these books, you'll often see in the pictures and the tributes all the references to all the important people that the person hung around with. Attorney General Barr writes about the people that he worked with and worked for him. It's a great tribute to the men and women of the Department of Justice who do important work every day, and I think that's an aspect of it that I really like. So I'm very glad that you're here, and I got a lot of questions for you, so get ready.
Okay.
But I'm going to start with the one that I think is not so hard for you, but it's a great aspect of the book. And you write beautifully about your family, especially about your mother, your daughters, and your wife. Tell us a little bit about, just to start us off, about your mother and how she met your father and what her influence was in your life, because you describe it beautifully in the book.
Okay, well, my mother was an Irish Catholic, raised in Hartford. Her father and mother both came directly from Ireland. He worked in the Colt gun factory, and they had a hard time during the Depression. She went to Yale. She was a very hardworking student. She went to Yale for her master's degree in English literature and then went out to teach in 1943 at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. Meanwhile, my father, who was from a Ukrainian Jewish family that had lived in London for a long time and then emigrated to the United States. My father was born in the United States. He was an academic type, sort of a professorial type, and he was, had gone to Columbia, and he went out to Missouri, and they met during the war, and she at first would not have anything to do with him because he was a secular, but eventually she went out with him, and they eventually got married. And my mother was she was very bright and was my father's intellectual equal or close to it, but she was very practical and get the job done. And my father was a little bit more of an absent-minded professor who was sometimes impractical. And I think that I've inherited some of my mother's traits.
Well, you tell a story about how you had some encounter with some tough kids on the block in Upper West Side where you lived, and your mother went running. What happened?
So I was about 6, and my brother probably was my older brother was 9 or something. We got held up in our lobby by these kids who at the time seemed big, but they probably were 15 or 16. A group of about 8 of them, and they took our gloves and our hats. This was wintertime, and they ran. And I pushed the button and said, we're being held up. And my mother suddenly comes out of the elevator, still wearing her apron in the middle of winter, and she charges down the street and chases after them for a few blocks and catches one of them and hauls him to a police officer. So that was sort of part of the neighborhood lore. Swift justice. Well, there was swift justice delivered in our household, I'll tell you that. 4 boys, and it was pretty rambunctious.
So the book, if you read through the book, it's kind of a tutorial of some of the major challenges the Justice Department has faced over the years. And one of the ones that you cover well, and when I travel around the country and I tell people about being able to talk to you, someone says to me, well, his description of the tension in religious liberty discussions is really outstanding. And what you say is that it's not people of faith trying to impose our faith on others. It's a kind of unfaith or anti-faith secular religion that's being imposed on people of faith or the rest of us, especially through schools. Could you talk a little bit, what are you talking about there? What is that other thing that's not traditional faith but is being imposed on us?
Right. Well, just in a nutshell, my argument is that in the West, we had the separation of church and state, which is a Christian notion that goes back to Christ and Augustine in the Middle Ages. And it was the function of the church and the family to educate, not the state. The state was not there to improve people's souls, right? But to take care of people when they were acting devilishly. And but in the 19th century, when we started universal education, we made the decision to have it done through state institutions, state buildings, state employees. And we have the separation of church and state. And how did we reconcile the idea of educating people with this state institution that had to be religiously neutral? And we had, and the answer is we didn't for over 100 years. Up until 1960, we finessed it by just having the public school system generally reflect the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly Christianity, because as of 1960, 95% of the country self-identified as Christian. So they read the Bible, they prayed, and so forth. Even more overt signs of religion within certain communities that tolerated it. But in the 1960s, starting then, they started secularization by stripping religion out. And then during Obama's administration, they started secularization by not subtraction, but by addition, by indoctrination. Because there is this feeling that religion has to be more about reading, writing, arithmetic, but also character formation, moral values. But once you strip away religion and Christianity, what do you have left? And they're trying to inject into the school some explanatory reason for a set of morals that is essentially a secular and materialist credo. It's a lot of gibberish, like CRT and transgenderism and all that stuff, but that is secularization by addition, and it raises serious constitutional questions. And I think in a pluralistic society like ours, where there is a fracturing of religious belief, the only way you can really do it through state funding would be a voucher system. I think we have to move to a voucher system. Now's the time to be pushing choice for that reason, but for a host of other reasons as well.
So the story of you coming to the Trump administration as Attorney General the second go-around is a good one in that you saw a problem and you kind of volunteered despite it sort of conflicting with your personal life, which was going very well at the time, I gather.
Yeah.
But before we get to some of the more controversial aspects of the Trump administration, one of the areas that you got very involved in was cops and crime and attacks on police, and also examples of police brutality. Tell me what the role of the Attorney General is, what the role of the Department of Justice is in those kinds of disputes, and how did you execute on those during the Trump administration?
So the Attorney General has become, at least under Republican administrations, because Democrats don't like being sort of the spokesperson in a sense for law and order and the police. But in Republican administrations, you're the leader of the law enforcement community, and the cops look to the Department of Justice and the Attorney General to carry the message. And you also are drawn into it because you're the top enforcer of civil rights. So if cops allegedly misbehave, you have to judge that case. So you're drawn into it naturally that way. And I felt that we had crime go down every year for 22 years, starting in 1992. In 2014, it started going back up again, and part of that picture was the war against cops, which was a war against cops. This idea that the cops are the enemy and the bad guy and are a threat to the African-American citizenry. And I saw that coming back, in 2019 and 20. It's a bogus thing, because once you really drill down, you see what the situation is, which is a cop is attacked, seriously attacked, like with a weapon, 50 times a day in this country. And they shoot and kill maybe 2.5 people a day. out of 50 attacks. To me, that doesn't suggest they're out of control. And of the people they shoot, out of the 1,000 they shoot a year, 25% are African American. Now, African Americans are 13% of the population, hence the idea that this is overrepresented. But the people who are shot are people that they're arresting or people that they're pursuing. And when you look at who's committing the crime, actually that's a reasonable number, because 37% approximately of violent crime is committed by African Americans, and 50% of homicides are committed by African Americans. So the fact that 25% of the 1,000 that are shot a year are African American doesn't suggest it's out of control.
And you made that case. And,
Yeah.
and what's it like? Give us a sense of your, one of the things about you as an attorney general is that you weren't and there's language in the book that takes on a response to the, quote, left. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about your view of that battle. The culture, it's almost a cultural war battle.
Well, it is. I mean,
why did you feel comfortable as the chief law enforcement officer engaging in those debates?
Well, on the crime issue, I had been involved in the first go-around. The federal government really wasn't involved in violent crime very much before 1991-92. And to make a long story short, after 3 decades of really surging crime, it quintupled between 1960 and 1990. It had flattened out during Reagan, but it was still going up. Reached its peak in 1991-92. It was twice as high as it is today, although we're losing that because it's going up so sharply now. But anyway, I persuaded Thornburg that we really have to lean in and go after gangs, go after repeat violent offenders, people who use guns. And we started putting a lot of people away, and we trebled over the next 22 years, the federal prison population trebled and the state prison population doubled. And we were pushing the states to take the violent offenders off the streets and put them in prison, incapacitate them. That's the only, if you look at the graph of violent crime, it's very striking. There's never been anything like it, as the President Trump would have said. And 22 consecutive years of reduced crime in this country. And the first speech I gave as AG said, we're repeating all the mistakes of the 60s and 70s. We're going back to revolving door justice, and crime's going to go back up, and it has. Yep. Yeah. So I've been hammering on this issue for a long time, and the cops know it.
One of the things that you faced and the Justice Department faced, and I'm very aware that the Justice Department is an executive branch agency under the supervision of the President of the United States. But there is a norm, an expectation that the political people in the White House will stay out of criminal prosecutions, indictments, investigations. Tell us, and you describe a lot in the book, about the extent to which your department was pressured on criminal prosecutions and investigations. What was that like? What were the examples of that?
Well, the President was actually good about not directly discussing these things with me when I was interviewing with him. And I wasn't pursuing the job, but I did talk to him. But I said, look, the one thing you have to stay out of is the criminal prosecution decisions. It's okay for you to say, I want you to, if some, mass shooting occurs, say, really go after that, but we can't get into these sensitive prosecutions and have you talking about investigations, have you talking about them with justice. I'll keep out of it completely. And he did. He didn't really discuss it with me directly, but he'd go off tweeting and making his sentiments known publicly, which then created the impression that he had a hand in this or that I would respond to it. So that made life difficult.
Well, I have to follow up on that because I thought there was some specific efforts on his part or people of his staff on the Durham investigation.
To which one?
To get an indictment before the election.
No, he actually, he never, he would never explicitly direct me to do anything like that. But the most he would do initially was just, so how's it going with Durham? And then he'd look intently to see if he could catch anybody. I'd say, it's coming along, coming along.
But he says to you, you quote him as saying, you quote him as saying a couple times to you something like, you could be a hero here.
Yeah, so that's what he was, no, he didn't say to me, he said that on the news. So he'd go on Maria Bartiromo, who seemed to be his favorite show for this kind of thing, and he would say, Bill Barr could either be a hero or else he'll just go down as another schnook. I hope he's doing more than just going for a few low-level people, because Obama and Biden were behind this. I hope he indicts them. They're criminals. Now, that was not a good thing. But that was in May, and then he did it a couple of more times. And then he made it clear, like, isn't something going to happen before the election? And I wouldn't discuss it with him, and he got very frustrated.
But you have, in other contexts, and Republicans and friends of ours that we know have been concerned about this idea. For instance, you say, this is one of the pathologies of our age. People have come to think that simply because circumstance suggests wrongdoing, some set of people should go to prison for a crime. Some on the left and the right seem always ready to lock them up without worrying about pesky things like sufficient evidence.
Right, I wasn't referring to, well,
okay.
I encounter it today, but as AG, why aren't these people already in orange jumpsuits?
Yeah.
And why aren't they going to prison? And people say to me still on this, you should be in prison. I'm just wondering for what, But a few people, most people don't say that. But that is 25 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago, you didn't see all these legal talking heads on news programs or out in the public thing. There wasn't the criminal justice process hadn't been finely honed into a political weapon, which it is today. And now the immediate reaction of people to things is, let's find some statute that was violated.
But if it's been honed into a political weapon, and that's been allowed to be in the public discussion, isn't it a good thing that there are people like you and Jeff Rose and others that resist that explicit pressure?
I think that's the job of the Attorney General, and a good Attorney General isn't going to be pushed around on it. So, but when I was up being for confirmation under Bush, I was getting hammered, or maybe it was even after I was getting hammered because we hadn't indicted. This cuts against what I just said, but we hadn't indicted. What was that scandal where Wonder Woman's husband was involved in? Robert Altman. Altman. No, it was the bank. BCCI. BCCI. Why aren't they already in jail? The DA in New York, Morgenthau, has already indicted them. Yeah. Well, that was thrown out, and it was a joke. And I said, I'm not going to be buffaloed by anybody, okay? Yeah. When we have evidence by which we can prove a crime, we'll indict, not a moment before. And that's always been my attitude. And that's my attitude with, these yahoos are out there thinking that you can quickly, just throw James Comey in jail because you heavily suspect, as many people do, that this, was a dirty trick that was being played. You can't, the Department of Justice standard is we have to feel we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt to prove to a jury.
So you're talking about yahoos and people who are giving that kind of advice. The book describes a group of people that were around the president, especially near the end of his administration, who you refer to as being willing always to tell him what he wanted to hear.
I thought you were going to actually quote what I said about them.
What did you say about them?
They were whack jobs.
Whack jobs, yeah. Yahoos, whack jobs. So tell the audience about the influence of those people around the president and how you had to deal with it.
Yeah, some presidents get into trouble because they're isolated and they live in a bubble and they don't sort of reach out and hear from beyond the Oval Office. The problem with President Trump was exactly the opposite. once you were on his team, he essentially discounted what you said, and he spent all his time talking to people on the outside who told him, who all wanted to be useful to him and enjoy a relationship with the president. It was important for their ego to do so. They had no responsibility and no knowledge of what was going on, and they'd be there saying, send the 82nd Airborne into Portland, and then he would think that, this was the thing to do, and you'd have to explain to him all the problems that would flow from that in an election year. Namely, we don't have enough divisions to contain the riots that would be going on around the country. So that was a fundamental problem, and to be honest, the president had very good policy judgment on a certain set of issues like crime, immigration, maybe trade and other things like that. These were red meat issues. He had a good idea of where to go. When things were a little more complicated, he would sort of hang back and snipe at people the way he did on COVID, and he would sort of listen to all this advice, and he would have sort of chaos in the process. And then when he was frustrated with people not carrying out his desires, he would frequently try to run by recruiting this group of Keystone cops to run a play completely, without the people in government know what was going on. And that was what happened in Ukraine, and he got impeached for it. And that was what happened on January 6th. Both things were sort of clown shows.
But it also could have happened on election fraud, and in that they were trying either to replace you or to replace the Deputy Attorney General Rosen, and later in the period of time.
Well, Rosen was my secret weapon.
Yeah. But the question is, are you confident that in another circumstance that kind of pressure wouldn't have led to an undermining of the Constitution or undermining of our, some of our basic tenets? I mean,
I'm pretty confident of it. I don't think it was an insurrection. I don't think the president incited it within the legal sense. I think he's responsible for it because he led people to believe there was something that could be done up in Congress during the counting process, and this crowd had a big element in it that was looking for a fight, and were clearly looking for a fight. So I do put that at his doorstep to an extent, but I didn't really think the Republic was ever in danger. I just actually thought it was a bunch of clownish individuals doing this thing that would never had any chance of success.
After
the reason I left on December 14th, I resigned. I gave him my resignation on December 14th because that was the day the states certified the votes, and they all certified the votes, and there was no way of turning around the election, in my opinion, at that point.
After obtaining legal advice from a range of constitutional scholars, including my friend and colleague from the George H.W. Bush administration, Judge Mike Luttig, Vice President Pence rightly concluded that his constitutional responsibility was faithfully to count the Electoral College votes as they had been cast. The president, nonetheless, scapegoated the vice president and castigated for his supposed disloyalty. After January 6th, I told Pence how much I respected him for what he had done. He is a patriot, loyal to the Constitution, and he did his duty regardless of any political cost to himself.
Right.
So,
But the
point is, it wasn't some unserious thing that they're sort of chatting about. Don't take it seriously. It's not really going to happen. The president's he's not really trying to pressure. He was trying to pressure.
No, he's trying to, but Pence was never really susceptible to that. But even if he was, Congress would not have gone along with that. No lawyer in any of this stuff went along with it. Nobody in the executive branch. None of the states went along with it. None of the states changed their certifications. They sort of humored the president by having these meetings with him and talking, but they never did anything.
But when you say no lawyer, you mean no lawyer in the Department of Justice, but there were lawyers advising.
DOD didn't do anything. DHS didn't do anything. They all held the line. The whole White House lawyers, all the justice lawyers.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it was such a preposterous idea, and so silly that I don't think it was ever the Republic was ever at risk.
Okay.
That's the way I...
Now, you have a reference in the book, even that you described it, that you were aware of it in advance. And it has to do with the former president's management style. And it's the term shelf life. Well, how would you characterize his loyalty down to people who served him well?
0. No one, I think, could point to an example of him ever doing, anything that caused him discomfort or inconvenience or any capital for anybody else.
Okay, so...
But I knew that going in, and I wasn't, I didn't go in because, I'm starstruck at some politician or a president. My view was he was the president of the United States. I felt there was an effort to, I was very skeptical of Russiagate. I thought that it could well be an effort to throw him out of office unjustly, and he wasn't getting his due as president. And someone had to do something about it.
Yeah, and let's follow up on that. That, you really, I don't want to sound too sycophantic, but you were proven absolutely correct about that. I mean, about Russiagate. I mean, now looking at it, how do you describe what happened there? We have a columnist for the Wall Street Journal yesterday that wrote pretty critically that Mrs. Clinton should have known what she was getting herself involved in. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, essentially what I've said all along, and I want to be guarded in what I say, but, you sort of wonder, how could intelligent people go down this road unless maybe there was something? So there was always that question in my mind, could there be something? But from everything I could tell as outside, and then certainly reinforced when I got inside, it was inexplicable to me how this could have been taken seriously by the FBI and pursued by the FBI unless, there was some other agenda being pursued. And, I thought the Hillary campaign obviously had gotten this thing out, and they had obvious motivations to do, political motivations to do it. But I always thought the real issue was what happened after the election, because it looked to me like the FBI and Comey doubled down at a time where they knew or should have known that the dossier and all that stuff was just drivel. And so what's the explanation for that? Now, one of the things I tried to explain to the president is that one of the reasons I could deal with volume 2 of the Mueller report, which was all about obstruction, tried to explain to him, and it's what my famous unsolicited 19-page memo was about, which is that when government officials are doing things that they have the authority to do within their office, and then trying to prove that that's a crime, it's a very dangerous road to go down unless you have very strong objective evidence of criminality. Most crimes, as you know, have a bad act, actus reus, and a bad state of mind, mens rea. But in our society, we're moving much more toward a situation where we're saying, well, no, you don't need a bad act. You can do a authorized act, you just do it with a bad state of mind. And that's a slippery slope. And so trying to prove that FBI people had a conspiracy and had a criminal state of mind, you need some pretty good evidence. And I tried to explain to the president that that's hard to come by. It was particularly hard to come by when there were no grand juries in the country from March to October, right before the election. So when all these people were sort of saying, why is Durham taking so long? I've tried to explain to them that the Inspector General was looking at the FBI, and he would not share anything with Durham or come out with his final report until December 2019, the end of 2019. So before that, Durham was looking, running down cats and dogs of some other conspiracy theories. Were the Brits involved? Were, the CIA involved? And all these little stories. So he's trying to do his best to get at some of that. Meanwhile, what I considered the main course, or one of the main courses, was on hold until the end of 2019. Then what happens 3 months later in March? Grand juries shut down around the country. What does that mean? I'm not saying he had a grand jury, but if you don't have a grand jury, the ability to convene a grand jury, no one's going to sit down and talk to you voluntarily. So you call someone and say, we'd like to ask you some questions. No, I'm taking care of my mother. I'm worried about COVID, I'm not coming in. No one talks to you. And that was the case until October before the election. So this idea that, Durham could sort of go and whip up a case, like that with proof beyond a reasonable doubt that people in the FBI or some of these other people were criminals and should go to jail was just a fantasy.
I wanted to ask you about the conclusion of the Mueller investigation. I urge everyone to read your description of those days and how you handled that and the statement you put out and the reaction you got to it. But looking back now on Robert Mueller's investigation and the way his staff dealt with you in the Justice Department, what is there more to say about that? I mean, what's the conclusion of that episode, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, if I wanted to say it, I said it in there.
In the book. Yeah.
but I think for whatever reason, I don't think Mueller thought much of Trump. I think he went out and he recruited partisan Democrats, a whole team of them, which defeated the very purpose that Rod Rosenstein had of having somebody who was going to look at it from a assure the United States it was going to be looked at fairly. And as a result, half the country didn't have confidence in what he was doing, and that was his own doing, and that really hurt the country. And then, although by the time he came in May of 2019, or within a few weeks, it should have been crystal clear that there was no collusion and all the predicates for it were vaporware. And instead of shutting the thing down for the good of the country, he kept it going for over a year to pursue these obstruction theories, which were a never-ending set of bootstrapping. They started out with two theories, the firing of Comey and this comment like, I hope you can see your way clear to go, to let it go about Flynn, neither of which would ever be considered obstruction. And if you read his report, you see he doesn't even end up relying on those. But that's what kept them going. The president getting furious because he knows there's no collusion. And then the more angry he gets and taking untoward action, that becomes the next obstruction. And then that sends the president to orbit, and then that becomes the next obstruction. It was a disgrace, the whole thing. And of course, the idea that I misrepresented things is just a temper tantrum by the people who had all the faith that Mueller would be St. George and slay the dragon, and they were just throwing a temper tantrum. But the bottom line is, and this is another thing, I told Mueller, you have to give me the report showing me what has to be redacted. Yes. So I can put it out, because I can't afford a delay. The whole world will be wondering whether he's going to jail or not, the president. He gave it to me without any redactions. So I knew there'd be 2 or 3 weeks. So what would any normal person do at that point? They'd tell the people the bottom line, is he going to jail or not, right? Yeah. And so, 1, there was no collusion. 2, he didn't reach a conclusion on obstruction. He says he didn't exonerate the president, but he didn't say the president violated the law. And 3, I'm making the decision, and I'm saying there was no obstruction. That's what the people had to be told, and I told them, and there was no misrepresentation.
Yeah. Okay, I have just a couple more questions. I want to come back to the election and the fraud issue and the role of the Attorney General, just for a moment. You say the election was not stolen, Trump lost it. Mm-hmm. You still feel confident of that judgment and based on anything you've said, but you do have a pretty elaborate description of the ways in which voting was changed because of COVID, and that it could have led to some issues of abuse or fraud. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit, and where you think the election was lost, and how it relates to Trump's personality and the way he conducted the campaign? Because you have a lot in the book about that.
Yeah. Well, 2 things the president was hammered on during 2020 was, number 1, I told him he'd lose election. Others did too.
Yeah. Well, it's just you went and saw him, and you told him you're going to lose.
You're going to lose the election. I told him in April, you're going to lose the election. You have to repair the damage done in suburbs. Any sentient person, living in some of these states like Pennsylvania and Virginia saw exactly what happened to the Republican vote in our suburbs. It collapsed by at least 10%. And you have to repair that damage, and your base is with you. So you don't have to continue to throw raw meat at your base. He had this view that he'd get 65 million votes out of his base, which it wasn't all from his base, but he got 75 million votes. But he didn't, that's number one. And number two, he was told by numerous lawyers that you have to start pushing back against some of these rule changes. There's some cases that have to be brought in Pennsylvania and in Georgia, and he just blew it off. Probably because they told him that the only way he could get really expert and effective help would be to put $20 or $30 million in escrow, because no lawyers will work for him because he doesn't pay them and he screws them at the end of the day. So he said, put $30 million in escrow, bring in a firm, and fight during the year to get these rules right. He didn't do it. That's the preface, okay? So people are lumping together, I think, a lot of different things. Number one, the rules were changed under the under the excuse of COVID. They skew the play. A lot of these rules skewed the playing field. Some of them are questionable as to whether they can be done properly by the state or whoever did it properly. Most of those issues were litigated without success. But anyway, there was the tilting of the playing field. But once the election's held, you got to win under whatever rules are in place at the time, okay? Yeah. Number two, there were violations of rules that are meant to prevent fraud. And their violation may increase the opportunity for fraud, but they're not fraud. So if you exclude an observer, which really didn't happen, but if you exclude an observer, that's such a violation. The remedy is not to say that every vote cast during that period was illegal. You still have to show there was some fraud. And harvesting was the biggest and most important example of that. I say in the book, I think there was probably, they were harvesting where they shouldn't have harvested. I don't think that changed the outcome of the election, and I think this film by Dinesh D'Souza is nonsense. But that was the second group of things. The point is you don't get relief of changing votes by showing that there were harvesting. You still have to show the votes were invalid. Okay. Furthermore, as I tried to explain to the president, you have 5 or 6 weeks to do it because the Electoral College is baked into the Constitution. You only have 5 or 6 weeks. He started right off the bat on this idea of fraud, and everything they put out, starting on election night at 2 in the morning when he declared there was major fraud underway, up until today, everything he's pointed to as fraud is nonsense. It's just not true. And on January 13th, he was challenged by NPR and he walked off the set. But they basically said, what's an example of this fraud? You would think after much time has gone by, he'd have a pretty good example. His example was more people voted in Philadelphia than were registered voters. That there were people in Philadelphia. Neither is true. The turnout in Philadelphia was sort of tepid compared to the turnout in the rest of the state. And frankly, he did better in Philadelphia than
he was expected.
Yeah, than Republicans have generally done. And you know what? The big cities are not where all the votes came from that hurt him. They pretty much did what they always did. The votes that hurt him were in the suburbs. And if you go through the suburbs, you will see that he got hurt badly in the suburbs. Even the exurbs that were deeply red and where he won, his margins were lower than last time. That's where the votes came from that killed him. And as I've kept on saying, in Arizona, 75,000 Republicans voted straight Republican except for him. He lost by 10,000 votes. In Wisconsin, it was 50,000 or 60,000, the same thing in Pennsylvania. He ran weaker than the Republican ticket. And, and my view was, you're not going to win a close election if you're the weak sister on the ticket, which he was in those battleground states. That's the bottom line. And you compare that to a real populist like Reagan. When he was up for re-election, he won Pennsylvania by 470,000 votes over and above the Republican ticket. 500,000 in one state. Those are the Reagan Democrats. And here's, that's the difference. Trump divided the Republican Party. He didn't have in order to get the rural working class vote, he did not have to antagonize the suburban voters to the extent he did.
And not just to, because I can't resist, and it is in the book, you say in the book that you spoke to him specifically about the runoff race in Georgia, that you said to him, you need to help, or you should do something to make sure that those seats are not lost.
Right.
And how did he react?
Well, it was clear to me he wasn't going to do anything. He was feeling vindictive toward, the senators didn't help him enough. They'd never done enough for him. And he said at that, he said, I don't really know them, And I said, I really don't know, the woman there, but I know David Perdue, and he's a first-rate senator. And of course, then Perdue became his best buddy, and he put him up to run against Kemp.
Okay, so last question for me. It concerns issues of today. Justice Alito is in the news. You know Justice Alito for a long time. What's your take on this really sort of unpleasant controversy concerning the leak of a Supreme Court draft opinion and of Justice Alito's jurisprudence?
Well, first it shows, something else I discuss in my book, which is, the modus operandi of the progressive left, which is that the ends always, their holy ends, their march toward being on the right side of history and bringing about some kind of earthly nirvana justifies anything they do. So this is just another example of that, a very sad one. But first, I would not assume that there were 5 solid, locked-in votes on that. There might well have been. I have no way to know, but that could have been drafted based on tentative expressions of views, like, oh, I'm inclined to go this way, and I'd like to see how it reads, that kind of stuff. But I'd be inclined to. And as we all know from the Obamacare case, these things can change up until the moment the opinions are released. And I think many of you know that you can read opinions that were clearly written as majority opinions that later become dissent just because people shift at the last moment. So I wouldn't assume this was all baked. But otherwise, I think it seems to me that it looked like somebody trying to derail it from the left, and I don't think it's going to work, and I think they should go to jail.
Okay, let's open it up for questions from the audience. Who has a question? Let me see what we got. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you about the Durham investigation. Excuse me. I want to ask you about the Durham investigation. When you think that it's over, what do you think the broad storyline of it will be?
Probably the same as you think it's going to be. I because I appointed him and I was, aware of its general direction before I left. I don't want to get too much there, but, I've always suspected, let me put it that way, I've always suspected, that its genesis was a dirty trick, and I've been concerned that they went too far, including the FBI going too far before the election, and that after the election there was an attempt to bring Trump down.
But just to follow up on that, there's a trial that has begun, right? Isn't there a trial
next month?
So when
I think.
Will there be
Is it
more
next month?
indictments?
This month? I live in the past.
Are you saying that will lead to further indictments concerning that attempted dirty trick, or that's what the evidence will show just generally?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. Next question. Yes.
But I do
I'm
think.
going to come to you next, Dr. Strait.
I think you have been able to see the hard slog that Durham has to engage in to get to the bottom of things. And I think he's a tenacious guy who will, if it's possible to get to the bottom of it, he will get to the bottom of it, and he will write a thorough report. And so, to the extent he's in a position where he can prove criminality beyond a reasonable doubt, I think he'll bring those cases. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there was no wrongdoing, maybe not provable criminal wrongdoing, but I think he'll tell the story.
You think you should write a report and publish it?
I directed that he do.
Your view, as you expressed it, is that the president's attempts to overturn the previous election were not particularly serious. They weren't taken seriously by decision makers, by people in authority. I wonder if you could look forward to the next election, and if you have any views on efforts that are taking place at the state level to kind of tilt power back toward the Electoral College and toward the state legislature and away from the voters. And then I also relatedly wonder if you have any thoughts, again, that are forward-looking about the kind of cultural damage that the president's efforts may have done. We have a situation where power did not transfer peacefully. If you count the violence that took place at the Capitol, that hasn't happened in the United States since the Civil War. We have a situation where the majority of voters in one of our two parties believe that the election was stolen. And we have a situation where the president, where the candidate who lost still isn't admitting defeat, which is a pretty big change in democratic norms. Are you concerned about either efforts at the state level or about those kind of changes in norms and culture affecting elections going forward?
I mean, you could speak forever on this topic, but the first one was essentially what should be done going forward at the state level to prevent further mischief in the future. Is that it?
Or your comments on things that are happening at the state
Well,
level.
So the legislation passing,
Yeah.
the shutting down of the COVID expansions.
Sure.
Anything on those scores?
Well, even before all this happened, when I first came in to office, I took the position we should have zero tolerance for political violence. I told the FBI they better get on top of Antifa. I tried to get hundreds of more U.S. Marshals so that the United States had a civilian capacity to deal with civil unrest. And I kept on saying that we have to really be careful about how we're changing these rules for the election, because in a closely divided country where the stakes are so high, they're playing with fire. And I kept on saying these people who want to turn our elections into an honor system are playing with fire, because people aren't going to have confidence in the outcome. Now, the left will take my remarks and my concerns about that and say, you created, the environment of January 6th. On the contrary, I think the criticisms were absolutely right, and they've created the situation with playing fast and loose with these rules that half the country doesn't have confidence in the election. And even if there was no fraud, that's a separate issue. Was there, in fact, fraud? And my attitude is, look, just because a drunk driver gets home safely once doesn't mean you want to repeat the experiment. So I believe the Republican Party the parties in the states especially have to focus on this with all their energy. And there are efforts underway on the state and national level to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or at least in the critical battleground states, we don't have the same degree of game playing. But this goes back to the fundamental point that the left has thrown the rule book out the window. There are no rules. And all this stuff about, how they project, all this stuff about shredding norms, it's not I don't think it was the Republicans or Trump for that matter. Let's hold off on the discussion at January 6th that shredded norms, it was mainly the left. But the second part of your question was?
Confidence in elections eroded by the losing candidate refusing to concede.
Oh, how much is Trump? I still think at the end of the day, I don't know how to describe it. It's like, one of these self-destructive marriages where each one is sort of bringing out the worst in the other, and it just continues to escalate. But Trump was a symptom, a product of left excess. He's not the cause of the bitterness in the system. He's the result of it. And it was engendered by the sharp turn of the Democrats to the left. And even empirical studies show that's the case. You know, the Republicans have pretty much been the same. If anything, they've softened on some social issues. Democrats have moved sharp left, and they've adopted. I don't believe they're operating within the Anglo-American political tradition anymore. They're not liberals. They are Jacobins, and they're trying to tear the system down. And that's what brought Trump to power. That and their alliance with the media as agents of change, so I think, you know, one of my things I basically say in the book is a lot of Trump's obnoxious traits that in normal times are obnoxious and are obnoxious actually worked for him and may have been necessary in 2016. Helped him break through the hostility of get his message out and so forth. And he tapped into that resentment among middle class and working class Americans. But as I basically say in the book, if we want to make America great again, what I want to say to Trump supporters, of whom I was one, and paid my dues for supporting Trump. Let's talk about making America great again. You don't make America great again by, Trump's, if Trump is the nominee and is elected, it'll be a 78-year-old lame duck by law, and whose personal style is extremely petty and is constantly in mortal combat without any strategic sense. It's just the fight of the moment, regardless of the consequences. I'm all for fighting, but what I want to see, and I think what the groundwork is being laid for, because this is like the 60s and 70s that laid the groundwork for Reagan. Democrats go far left. They try to patch up their own differences by bringing in an empty vessel who's overwhelmed by the problems, and it lays the groundwork for what could be a decisive victory. And if the Republicans put up a candidate who could, like Reagan, unite the party and bring over some of the classical liberals who are revolted at what's going on in the progressives, you could have a decisive victory that lays the groundwork for 15, 20, 25 years of dominance. And Trump is not that man. Trump is another. At best, he'll squeeze out another victory, and we'll have 4 more years of bitter trench warfare and bashing each other. People say, how can we bring the country together? We need a unifier and so forth. It's hard, it takes two to dance, and I think the first step to bringing the country back together is to a decisive victory. I think back, Reagan was an affable guy and tried to be the president of all, but liberal became a dirty word after Reagan because he won, and he won decisively. So, 40 states, 49 states, Bush has 40 states. Those were victories. Anyway.
Yes, sir. Last question.
Thanks, Mr. Barr. Jerry Dunleavy with the Washington Examiner. So you said that you think that the genesis of the Crossfire Hurricane Trump-Russia investigation was a dirty trick.
No, I didn't. Well, the genesis of it, I think it was occasioned by a dirty trick.
Occasioned by a dirty trick. Okay. And when IG Horowitz came out with his report, it was his conclusion that there was adequate predication, but yourself and John Durham came out with what was then a kind of a rare statement for John Durham, saying that you had seen other evidence to indicate that Horowitz had maybe reached the wrong conclusion. And so I was wondering if you were able to shed any more light on what evidence you saw there. And then I am going to cheat and ask a second question about just sort of your decision not to appoint a special counsel to investigate the Hunter Biden situation, whether you have confidence in David Weiss, the attorney, the U.S. attorney there to handle it, and whether you have confidence that A.G. Garland won't somehow exert influence over the investigation.
So I wouldn't assume the difference of I wouldn't assume the difference of opinion on predication has to do with, there's some other great fact out there that's going to blow everyone's socks off. We'll see what Durham says, but it could just be in the eye of the beholder. Horowitz's position was that the threshold is so low that it met it. I don't think the threshold is as low as it was articulated by Horowitz. Moreover, I think the basic idea behind it, especially when you're dealing with spying on Americans, has to be that the basis for your actions has to justify the actions you take, the extent of the actions you take. I don't think it's like a light switch, like saying, oh, okay, it's enough to open. Now, Katie barred the door, We can do anything and everything we want by way of investigation. It has to be calibrated. It has to be reasonable under the circumstances. I don't think it was anywhere near reasonable what was done.
Second question was about Hunter Biden.
So, the idea of handing it out to a special counsel should be done if you believe that there's a conflict of interest. If I believe there was a conflict of interest of the department doing it. There certainly wasn't a conflict of interest of my department doing it. And whether there was a conflict of interest if a conflict of interest existed, it would be for the new administration and for them to make that determination, not me to make that determination. And if he felt that Weiss was not, it couldn't be done under his department, he should appoint a special counsel. Now, let me just say that I think under the circumstances, if I had appointed a special counsel, I'm not sure that that person would still be around. Because it would have looked at that point as if I was trying to, we lost the election, take this. I think that would have put them in a position maybe where they could have said that was just a political move. They could have said that early on. I'm just throwing
Well, he asked you about your confidence in the current attorney
Yeah, well, that
general.
was at the end, but before that, he
I'm
was
going to
sort
come
of
back
said,
to
why
you.
did you? So,
Because
so I
you
was
want to tell them
confident.
about your conversation with the president about Hunter Biden, where you said, I
yeah,
will
yeah.
not discuss this with you?
Yeah, so I just want to say that I was confident that when I left, Weiss would continue his job. I was very confident of that, and I've been proven right. So I didn't think it was necessary to prove. Yeah. So, the only time the president came right up to the line, and I won't speculate as to whether he would have gone over it, but a couple of weeks before the election, after when Rudy Giuliani was parading around the laptop, I got a call from the president. He said, this Hunter Biden thing. I said, Mr. President, I told you, I'm not going to discuss anything. And he said, well, if that was one of my kids. And I just said, God damn it, Mr. President, I'm not going to, and that was that. So, and my chief of staff was there, shocked. So.
We can end there.
I just want to say one thing.
Okay.
This goes back to the issue of trying to treat everything within the criminal justice process. And people have to understand that when you push something into the criminal justice process, number one, it's secret, and you go to jail if you talk about what's going on usually. And number two, it takes a long time. Maybe longer than it should, but it takes a long time. So it's not a very useful political device, okay? And what people do, and Hunter Biden is a perfect example of it, they had several weeks to tell the tale of Hunter Biden, and they didn't do it. Their game was to try to get a criminal investigation going. And that's usually now what the play is. It's an inside the beltway play. Let's get a criminal investigation. And then that becomes the issue. Is he going to be indicted? Instead of telling the story. The American people, if they knew the facts, would look at what happened, and whether it's a crime or not that will ever be prosecuted, they would see what it was, which was shameful self-dealing by that family. And instead of telling the story,
They ran to the prosecutors.
they made the question whether or not it was a crime. And we constantly do that today, and it's stupid. because, you know, the criminal justice process isn't suited for that. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Bill Barr.
Thank you.
Former Attorney General. Great. Thank you all for being here.